Hi Wild Hearthstone YouTube, Keith here again. We're continuing the Deadmines mini-set review with the latest batch of revealed cards, this time all 14 rare cards in the set. All of the common cards were reviewed in the previous video, so be sure to check that one out. Link is in the description. Again, these are quick and dirty first impression reviews. Since I haven't played with any of the cards, I can't say for certain how a card's going to perform in the future. It'll be fun to look back and see how far off the mark we were with this mini set. Also, again, we're doing this in a tier list format. Here's a quick breakdown of what the tiers mean. S tier cards are broken cards that are likely candidates for nerfs. A good example of an S tier card from the previous set that's a rare would be something like a Ruined Mithril Rod. A tier cards are staples that will see frequent play in their respective classes, or are core cards in high-powered archetypes. A good example of that in rare is Sanctum Channeler. B tier cards are playables or tech cards, but they're not auto-includes. You won't see them in every deck. A good example of something like that is SI7 Extortion. C-tier cards are fringe cards that will see niche play if they see any. A good example is Mailbox Dancer. And finally, D-tier cards are complete unplayable garbage, like Two-Faced Investor. Rares are going to be interesting to look at. These cards tend to be more powerful and more complicated than the commons. We're likely to see some very cool cards that will be interesting to look at. Now, I've also got the tier list rating from the commons still up as well. The rares are going to join the commons, and on the tier list, we're going to be able to see how the rares and the commons compare. Anyway, will any of these cards see play in Wild? Let's take a look. Going in class order, we're starting with Proving Grounds, Demon Hunter spell. 6 mana, summon 2 minions from your deck, and they fight. This is an interesting and strange card, a throwback to the recruit mechanic from way back in Kobolds and Catacombs. We've seen this with cards like Yasharj and Commencement. The problem with this card is there's a drawback to summoning these 2 minions. Because they fight, there's a likelihood that they kill each other, which means that this doesn't work very well with traditional large minions. You wouldn't want to play this to pull like Yasharj alongside another minion larger than Yasharj. You might be able to build a deck around this so that when you summon minions, you can guarantee that a certain minion lives, and the minion that dies gives you some kind of benefit from that. An example I can think of off the top of my head is summoning Yasharj Rage Unbound plus Scrapyard Colossus. The Yasharj will attack the Scrapyard Colossus, which leaves behind a 7/7 taunt, and then Yasharj summons yet another minion out of your deck. That can be a very powerful effect. This is going to require some very deliberate deck building to make this card work, but it's a very strong effect. It'll be interesting to see what we can do with it. Another issue that I see with this, though, is as of now, Demon Hunter doesn't have a ton of recruit-style effects that would work well in a deck that also plays this card. It might be a thing where it's not very strong now, but it could be a real card in the future. Because of that, I'm going to rate this as a B tier card on sheer potential. It's very likely that we see some kind of combo emerge that will bring Proving Grounds up a little bit in the tier ranking. Next up, in Druid, Jerry Rig Carpenter. 2 mana, 2/1, Pirate. Battlecry, draw a choose 1 spell and split it. Any pirate minion can summon Patches and Parachute Brigand, so it's going to be stronger than your average 2 mana 2/1. A 2 mana 2/1 that draws you a card is normally very strong in and of itself. This draws a card and turns it into 2 separate copies of itself. Okay, so it draws choose 1 spells. There's a limited variety of those cards. Most of them are not particularly powerful in and of themselves. It's interesting to play a 2 mana card that draws 2 cards, but the limit on what you can draw is going to hold this card back a little bit. It could be useful in a Druid deck that wants to play a lot of value cards for something like Nourish or something. The one thing that sticks out really that's going to hold this card back is that it's a 2 mana minion. It doesn't work with Oaken summons. All of the Druid decks that exist right now fall into one of 2 camps. Either they're decks with a lot of small minions that want to try to kill you quickly, or they are combo or value decks that play Oaken summons. This card does not work well with Oaken summons, so it's probably not going to see very much play just based on that fact alone. Factor that in with how strange the effect is and how limited the card draw is going to be with it, and I don't see this card gaining much traction in Wild. Anyway, we're going to call this one D tier. All right, next up, Moonlit Guidance. It's 2 mana Arcane Druid spell. Discover a copy of a card in your deck. If you play it this turn, draw the original. You can compare this with other Druid cards that fill a similar niche, like a card like Guess the Weight, which is a 2-mana draw one that has a condition to give you extra value. It's not going to be a card that you can play on 2 and get extra value from. It's going to be a card that would be reasonable to play later in the game that can give you some redundancy on cards that are in your deck. That being said, right now it doesn't fit into any existing Druid archetypes, and it's not the kind of card that would inspire an archetype by itself. We're going to call this one a C tier. All right, next up for Hunter, Doggy Biscuit. 2-mana tradable spell. Give a minion +2/+3. After you trade this, give a friendly minion rush. Let's establish the reality of what Hunter is in Wild right now. Hunter is a questline deck. This card does not fit in that deck, which means that it's very likely to see negligible play, just on that fact alone. That being said, could you find some use for this somehow? Like, Hunter doesn't really get very exciting buffs that are Wild playable anyway, so that's not really that big of a deal. After you trade this, give a friendly minion rush, that's interesting text. That turns this into a weaker animated broomstick that doesn't give you the condition of having to play animated broomstick. Does it have potential? Technically, yes. Is it a card that anyone's going to play? Probably not. That makes this card low C tier. All right, next up for Mage, Deepwater Evoker. It's a 4-mana 3/4 pirate, battle cry, draw a spell, gain armor equal to its cost. Mage doesn't have a pirate backbone, so to speak. It's harder to build a pirate aggro deck in Mage. The pirate tag on this minion is not as important as it would be, say, if this card were a warrior card, for instance. So let's take a look at the important part of the text, the battle cry. Draw a spell, gain armor equal to its cost. Mage has been interested historically in cards like this, or examples include cards like Arcanologist or Star Scry, or more recently Frostweaver Dungeoneer. The difference between those cards and this one is this card is more expensive. 4 mana compared to 3 and 2 mana is a huge deal. So compared to like Frostweaver Dungeoneer, this is a weaker card. However, let's say you built a deck around big spells in Mage. 4 mana gain 10 armor draw a spell, gain 5 armor draw a spell with bigger spells is probably going to be a pretty big deal. Another obvious home that I see for this is going to be Luna's Pocket Galaxy Mage. If you only play Luna's Pocket Galaxy in your deck, this will fetch it. Usually that deck wants to play other spells too, like Potion of Illusion, but there it is. Now, altogether, again, this is an interesting card, but it's not very powerful. It doesn't have an obvious home in a Wild archetype or push anything new. So we're going to call this one a D tier card. Next up for Mage, Arcane Overflow. 5-mana arcane spell. Deal 8 damage to an enemy minion. Summon a remnant with stats equal to the excess damage. So the obvious meme with this one is going to be compare it to an old card, Flame Lance. 5 mana, deal 8 damage to a minion. That card hasn't been playable for a very long time. It wasn't even playable back when it was printed. So that's not really a fair comparison. This card in modern Hearthstone, this is a very fair card, relatively speaking. 5 mana is a lot to pay for something that doesn't outright win you the game. The high roll for this card is paying 5 mana to destroy something with 1 health and then getting a 7/7 out of it. On the surface, that would look fairly powerful, but if you consider what other strategies are doing for 5 mana, you can probably do better. You could see this in a defensive like a Reno Mage deck. Might want something like this, but I still think that Reno Mage has better options, considering what that deck usually wants to do anyway. We're going to rate this one C tier. Okay, next up for Paladin, Righteous Defense. 3 mana holy spell. Set a minion's attack and health to 1. Give the stats it lost to a minion that's in your hand. This is another interesting card. Okay, so the dream with this is going to be to stare down your opponent's mountain giant or something and play this to turn the mountain giant into a 1/1 and give something in your hands and +8/+8. That seems like a huge swing. Consider this in a deck like Handbuff Paladin. Handbuff Paladin is already set up to use handbuff effects very effectively, with strong minions to buff like Chillblade Champion or Blade Master Samuro. The idea of using this card to super buff one of those minions sounds pretty sweet. Does that mean that this is going to see frequent play in Handbuff Paladin? If it makes sense to play this card, you're going to play it targeting something like Warlock that gives you plenty of big things to give you the buff. Against classes like Hunter or Mage that don't really invest in their minions at all, this card will sit dead in your hand. That's a pretty serious drawback. It's a powerful effect, but it's not universal. It's not something that makes sense to play all the time, but I can see a meta where minionless solitaire decks are relatively weak, and in that meta, this card is very strong. For that, we're going to call this one B tier. That might be ambitious for this card, because again, this card is pretty meta relevant, but when it is relevant, this card is going to be sweet. Next up, Wealth Redistributor. 5 mana, 2/8 Pirates. Taunt, Battlecry, swap the attack of the highest and lowest attack minion. This is another story like the Mage Pirate, where the pirate tag on this minion is not particularly relevant for deck construction. Seeing this come out of a Juggernaut is going to be really obnoxious and annoying. I would hate to see that, but let's just talk about whether or not you would put this card in a deck. 5 mana is a lot to pay, yet again, for anything, especially a card that doesn't represent a significant threat on its own. Like Righteous Defense, it's a pretty strong card against something like Mountain Giant. But this card being very expensive limits its potential. I don't see this card seeing significant play in Wild at all. If this card were 3 mana with a smaller body and the same effect, it would probably be maybe B or C tier. At 5 mana, I can't help but give it a D tier. All right, next up for Priest, Copycat. 3 mana, 3/4 beast. Battlecry, add a copy of the next card your opponent plays to your hand. So this is, what, a time release effect? It's clearly not going to give you a card they haven't played yet. It's pretty easy to play around something like this by simply playing a cheap card with a small effect, or by playing a card that the priest wouldn't be interested in playing at all. Is this card a good general purpose card? Decks like Reno, Questline Priest, or just Reno Priests in general might find this card interesting, but there are already a lot of cards in Priest that do something very similar to this that aren't as strong stats-wise, but are a little more straightforward in giving you the value up front, and don't give your opponent any control over what you get. So I don't see this card seeing a lot of play either. Not to say that it's a terrible card, but it's definitely fringe. We're going to call this one a C tier. All right, next up, for Rogue, Parlay. 1 mana Rogue spell. Swap this card for a card in your opponent's deck. There's going to be some highlight video somewhere with this, like somebody plays this card and gets someone's Togwoggle or something. That'll be pretty sweet to look at. It's clearly a meme card. It's a really interesting card. It's not a powerful card. It's not a powerful card because it's unreliable. There's no guarantee of what you get from this. In some kind of grindy value Reno mirror with a Reno Rogue deck playing Parlay, this is a ridiculous concept just thinking about it, but I can envision, because I know there are people that love those kinds of decks, I can envision a game where somebody plays Parlay and this card gets played 10, 15 times in a game, which is kind of absurd to think about. Anyways, any good? Oh no. No, it's bad. Oh, D tier. All right, for Shaman, we have Sucker Hook. 4 mana, 3/6 pirate. At the end of your turn, transform your weapon into one that costs 1 more. Kind of the theme of the rares of this set is weird stuff that looks interesting, but transforming your weapon doesn't really make a lot of sense. As far as I can tell, there are no ways to rig Sucker Hook so that you can get a consistent result, even with expensive weapons. Weapons at every price point in Wild kind of range the gamut of stuff. Like you could get, if you evolve like a 2-cost weapon, for instance, you could get like Fiery War Axe, or you could get Dragon Soul. There's so much variation. I don't expect this card to be anything close to reasonable in Wild. The minion itself is underwhelming. This card, D tier. Next up for Warlock, Hullbreaker. 4 mana, 4/3 demon. Battlecry and Death Rattle. Draw a spell, your hero takes damage equal to the cost. This card clearly doesn't work very well in any established Warlock deck. Like a deck that would play cards like Voidcaller and Archwitch Willow obviously doesn't want this. And even Warlock that would want this card for value, no, they have 1 mana life tap. Is there another non-even, non-Reno, or is there another like non-even lock deck that would care about this? Reno lock decks are going to want to play Voidcaller. Cube lock decks are going to want to play Voidcaller. The only place this makes sense really is something like Zoo, but there haven't been like non-cute, non-disco Zoo lock decks in Wild in a long time. This card has no home. It isn't strong enough on the surface to really inspire one. So we're going to call this one a D tier. All right, next up for Warrior, Blacksmithing Hammer. It's a 4 mana, 5/1 tradable weapon. After you trade this, gain +2 durability. The set's theme of tradable cards that give you some benefit when you trade them is interesting. It gives some duality to some otherwise underwhelming cards. Let's consider this. If you're putting this card in a deck, is a 4 mana, 5/1 weapon worth playing? Probably not. Is a 4 mana, 5/3 weapon worth playing? Like seriously, would you play a 4 mana 5/3 weapon, which is basically a cheaper Arcanite Reaper with +1 durability? You might be interested in that. If Pirate Warrior wasn't so obsessed with the quest line, this might be a reasonable card at that stat line, but the trick again is you have to trade it for it to be worth it. It's a weird card for an aggro deck because you almost never want to be using your mana that way in an aggro deck. In a like closer to a mid-range or a control style deck, most of those decks aren't really interested in a card that basically amounts to a pile of damage. Like 4 mana for 1.5 Pyroblasts is really strong. I think if you get to a point where you trade this, you get the payoff and you play it, there are probably stronger things that you can be doing that would win you the game in a more decisive fashion. And it's kind of weird that we're at this point where like I'm looking at a 4 mana Arcanite Reaper with +1 durability and thinking, yeah, no, that's not going to work. So yeah, D tier. Last up, for the rares, Multicaster. 4 mana 3/4 Pirate, Battlecry. Draw a card for each different spell school you've cast this game. This could be a solid card. There are a few classes that have access to multiple spell schools that might be interested in something like this. Shaman and Mage are the obvious homes right off the top of my head. Priest could probably do it, Druid could probably do it. I guess the high roll for this is you're probably drawing like 3 cards with it. 4 mana draw 3 and a 3/4 body is obviously strong. Setting up to make this that strong though, it's going to require that the deck be built in a certain way. I don't think it's worth it to build around Multicaster. I think that Multicaster is a card that might have a home in a deck that's already built in a way that can take advantage of this effect. Are there any decks like that exist right now? It doesn't fit into Druid because it's a 4 mana minion that's a low roll off Oaken summons. It doesn't fit into Priest because a lot of Priest decks are not diversifying their spell schools very much. So that leaves Mage and Shaman. I can see this in like Reno Shaman. Like a greedy Reno Shaman deck would love a card like this. So that leaves Mage. Mage is a kind of a one-dimensional class in Wild right now because Secret Mage basically died out, and Ignite Mage and like to a lesser degree the stuff like APM Mage or Questline Mage or Mizaki Mage are the only other decks that really float around very much in it. And those decks don't really want to run many minions, especially not ones that don't immediately further their game plan. Could one of those decks accommodate Multicaster? Maybe, but there are so many hoops that you kind of have to jump through for this card to work. If you can get it to work, it's obviously pretty sweet. We're going to call this one C tier. So that's it for the rare review for Deadmines. I think it's interesting that the rare cards for the most part were really kind of underwhelming in terms of like power level and Wild, to be honest with you. Like the best of them is a weird conditional play around in Demon Hunter with Proving Grounds, and a conditional buff spell with Paladin and Righteous Defense. Everything else as far as the rares is C tier or worse, which is fine. We started off pretty strong with the commons, especially considering like the strength of things like Defias Cannoneer and Defias Leper and Brilliant Macaw, stuff like that. So things kind of needed to even out statistically speaking. It's interesting to see how interesting the epics and legendaries are going to be. There should be 1 epic and 4 legendaries left. This is 30 cards, so we've already spoiled the majority of the set. Power level wise, it's about as strong as an average set. The good cards though are very good, like especially Defias Cannoneer is obviously insane. Anyway, that's it for the rare review. We're going to do the epic and legendaries review as those cards are spoiled too. If you like this channel and you want to see more of this kind of content, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, comment, and share. Thanks for watching.